Thank you for joining me for another BDSM United podcast in our slave training series. Torture to obtain submission or holding someone against their will has no place in a lifestyle, and it's also a violation of law in most countries. Modern day consensual master slave relationships are about a submissive agreeing to be trained to serve the master. In all cases, the words slave training mean consensual slave training in adherence to generally accepted BDSM lifestyle practices. If there is no consent or mutual agreement before you start, then that's called abuse. A master should design their training to mold the submissive into the type of slave they desire. Really, that's the goal of slave training altogether. If you wish a sex slave, then teach those skills. If you require domestic, then train in those skills. A master trains a slave to fit his needs. The slave can be trained to have many different skills if required. A new slave will find the lifestyle crammed with things like slave positions, protocols, speech restrictions, rituals, and rules. It's not an absolute to have all of these, but most new slaves actually respond well to them. The core of slave training is an art form based on knowledge and skills found in logic and reason. That's why we like to say that slave training is an art form, but also science. Well, this podcast is heavy on psychological theory. Remember, the fun of training a slave is grabbing him or her by the hair and or seeing them kneel before you with that look only the master sees in their eyes. This is stuff you're learning behind the scenes to make your scenes and ultimately your relationship better. The goal of behavioral slave training is to establish behavior that's consistent and reflects his or her slavery. This is agreed to training by both parties for the purpose of becoming closer in a master slave relationship. It is consensual training. Behavioral training means changing the slave's actions to serve the master or mistress better. It also allows a dominant to better manage the slave. Notice I didn't say micromanage because oftentimes in MS relationships, the goal of an MS is really not, or the scope of an MS being 24/7 really isn't micromanaging. Oftentimes it is training a slave to just instinctively know and do those things that please the master or mistress. Behavior is the seen actions of the body. A slave's behavior must be controlled before a dominant can rightly claim ownership of the slave. Behavior is the way a slave visually expresses slavery. It's the way he or she serves the dominant. The training prepares them for a future as your slave. Now, consensual slave training always includes behavioral modification. Let me say that again. Consensual slave training, it always includes behavioral modification in some form or fashion. A master controls when, where, and how the slave's body is used. Falling under the huge umbrella of behavioral slave training are slave positions, orgasm control, voice training, and any other actions of the body. A slave agrees of his or her free will to accept slave training and behavioral modification from the dominant. This is done to establish and develop a consensual relationship. The slave's behavior changes by using positive reinforcement in order to encourage desired behaviors or by punishing undesired behaviors. It takes both. A slave must feel the control of the dominant, that is the master or mistress. The sense of helplessness to control and change the behavior is essential and fundamental to slave development. Now, helplessness means that if the slave stays in the relationship, he or she will obey the dominant. He or she has no choice but to obey the dominant. The slave can leave, But if they leave, but if they stay, it is his will, the dominant's will, that the slave will follow. This requires a well thought out plan of action. You don't really want to just play this stuff by ear. The goal of behavioral slave training is to establish ownership of the slave's body. Behavioral modification means changing the slave's body's actions to serve and please the master and mistress. I'm kind of saying the same thing over and over again in a few different ways, just so that we're covering all of the bases. Slave training, behavior refers to the actions of the body. Closely associated with behavior are emotions, self image, and thoughts. Thoughts control behavior because a slave first thinks, then feels, then acts. A dominant can only truly judge a slave by what his five senses reveal to him. Try as he may, a slave owner cannot see into the slave's mind and heart. This is one thing he must be honest with the slave and accept. He cannot hear its thoughts or feel its emotions. He can only observe its behavior and come to a conclusion about what he sees or hears. Demonstrating proper behavior is the best way a slave shows its state of mind to the master and mistress, simply dominant. Repeated discipline training is very useful in early behavioral slave training. Behavioral slave training not only teaches the desired behavior that the master demands, but also helps mold their behavior, their attitude. Attitude and behavior are twin agents of change. A master must gain control of the slave in 5 different ways. 1, space. 2, the slave's time. 3, the physical actions. 4, the privacy. And 5, their relationships with others. This is not done with force. It's not done against the slave's will, but by their willingness to be owned and to serve. A master can develop a much better behavioral slave training program when they are aware of this, of these elements of behavior. He can design training that focuses on each of these elements. It's also effective to inform the slave that the master or mistress controls all of these areas, and explain how the dominant controls them. However, it takes more than just words. Action is necessary. A master must spend the time necessary using discipline training, practice, reinforcement, and punishment in order to change the slave's behavior. A side benefit of establishing rules, modes, and altering behavior is that it makes slave management much easier in the future. This becomes even more important where a master owns more than one slave, but oftentimes it's really important to think ahead and think kind of future oriented, anyways, because you want to create and begin to change and establish things in the here and now that make your job easier as a master or mistress down the road, even if you don't have more than one slave. In our next podcast, we're going to go into more detail about these areas of behavior, and we'll give you some more how-to instruction. I'm Primal Piggy. You can find me on Facebook at The Primal Piggy, or at Whips, Chains, and Duct Tape on Facebook at WCDT BDSM. But really the best place to start to begin to find us is by going to our website, which is BDSMUnited.com. If you're listening on your favorite platform, we ask that you leave a review, a thumbs up, a like, a follow, a subscribe. These are ways for you to connect with us, but it's also a way for other adults to also connect with BDSM education such as this, because when other adults in our lifestyle are educated, it makes our whole community better. And thanks for playing your part in that. I'll talk to you again soon.